Thank you so much. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Jatin Dua for our Indian Ocean Working Group Loiy Hammad Memorial Lecture this evening. Jatin Dua is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Director of the University of Michigan Center for South Asian Studies. His research explores processes and projects of law and economy along the East African coast and the wider Indian Ocean region. His book, Captured at Sea, Piracy and Protection in the Indian Ocean, appeared from University of California Press 2019, was a winner of the 2020 Elliott P. Skinner Book Prize for the best book for the Association for Africanist Anthropology. The book is based on a multi-sided ethnographic and archival engagement with contestations over legitimate and illegitimate commerce and exchange. Focusing on the ransom economy of Somali piracy, the book places protection as central to global mobility to see how a variety of actors from pirates and Dia kinship groups in Somalia to naval ships and Indian dhow captains at sea, as well as insurance agents and security consultants in London, create and regulate order and disorder within economies of piracy and counter-piracy. In addition, Professor Dua has published a number of articles on maritime anthropology, seafaring, insurance, ransom economies, and property at sea. His current research projects continue this emphasis on maritime worlds and their entanglements with law, sovereignty, economy, and sociality in the Indian Ocean and beyond through a focus on choke points, on port making in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and African mobility and its relationships to global shipping and maritime capitalism. It is quite an honor. Again, the book is a must read. I have it here. I read it once and I have to go back and read it again. And so please make sure we have ordered it in the library to look at the wealth and the opulent ethnographic research from which we truly learned a lot. I will turn it to Professor Dua. Welcome, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be virtually here in Doha, and I'm looking forward to sharing my work with you. So the talk today comes from my book, Captured at Sea, Piracy and Protection in the Indian Ocean, which focused on locating the unprecedented rise of Somali piracy from around 2005 to 2013 within longer histories and geographies. Right? So the book argues for, in many ways, understanding piracy within, always with this sense of moving back and forth between the contemporary era and contemporary shipping and questions about maritime commerce with longer histories of trade and contestation over long distance commercial networks in the Indian Ocean. And I kind of, find this moment of this juxtaposition that you see on the screen with the port of Jeddah on one hand and some graffiti from Fort Jesus in Mombasa, Kenya, two places where I did research. The overlay, this is very much when I was doing my research was at heart. And another was thinking about piracy not only as a question about Somalia, and I'll in the talk sort of highlight what it means to reframe piracy away from a question about Somalia, but to locate it within, again, this question of connectivity and its interruptions and ruptures that happen in the Indian Ocean. And in some ways, the book argues for extending our understanding of where is piracy beyond the Somali coast, but also where is the Indian Ocean beyond the actual literal space, to look at actors in places as far afield as London and insurance agents in the UK and other places. So it also is interested both in thinking about temporality and time, but also about geography and space. And the book came from, in many ways, a kind of mobile ethnography, and I'm happy to, in the Q&A and other times, talk about both time in Somalia, time at sea, time in these Indian dhows that I will be talking more about in this talk. And finally, also in places like Lloyd's of London and these other commercial places. So the methodology of the book is one that tries to, in essence, both follow the routes, but also some of the unexpected kinds of itineraries that happen as a result of Somali piracy. And one of the things that I sort of begin in some ways when I first started this project back in 2007, piracy often meant these DVDs, which I guess most of us no longer see anywhere in the world, but nonetheless, and piracy was also seen as a vestige of some kind of past that had been Disneyfied and commercialized, right? And one of the things that Somali piracy enabled in some ways was a recognition of the fact that what happens at sea is often so hidden from everyday life, even though it is 90% of all our goods come from the sea. There still is a way in which these maritime connections are hidden. So part of the book is trying to also move beyond this, understand this sea blindness that we all in many ways suffer from, and in that it follows a rich tradition in Indian Ocean historiography, as well as more recent work that is coming on the oceans and their role in contemporary capitalism, in order to kind of claim piracy as something that constantly moves between land and sea. So I'll begin to the place where the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean meet. This is Ras Asir off the northern Somali coast. The water in Ras Asir is the bluest water you will ever see. We were on our way to the Lighthouse of Ras Asir, which marks the spot where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean. At the beginning of the 19th century, this mostly mist-covered promontory had become infamous as a graveyard for ships making their way from the relative calm of Aden or Berbera in the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. The Southwest Monsoon, when strong currents and gusty winds blow from the south, ships would often get caught in a whirlpool and find themselves thrown westward towards the treacherous rocky coast. Shipwrecks provided the Majratin inhabitants of this area with a steady source of profit. And importantly, the flotsam and jetsam of these wrecks was their ticket into the world of Indian Ocean trade and a source of political power on land. To curb this annual share of shipwrecks and end this profitable salvage economy, the construction of a lighthouse was proposed by both the British and later Italian protectorates. Somali coastline was dotted with cargo ships that had been hijacked on the adjacent highways of global maritime commerce. Inhospitable roadblocks meant that when I was traveling to this region, we never made it to the lighthouse. But Usman, a self-proclaimed historian of the Bari, the coastal region, and my companion with tales of shipwrecks that had been the mainstay of the coastal economy, the conversation turned to piracy. Shirmayo noted that piracy had at least made the Somali coast famous. People know we exist, he said. Before piracy, we used to sit patiently, hoping and praying to get a gift from the sea. Our ancestors found shipwrecks, but the Europeans ended that when they came. Then came containers, he said, referring to the widespread dumping of containers full of toxic waste along the Somali coast. I think the pirates may have an answer, he replied to me. Today, you cannot just wait for a gift from the sea. You might get poison like these containers. You have to be like these men, the pirates. You have to go out to sea and bring the gifts of the sea home. Millions of vessels are at sea, from small fishing boats stitched together with balsa wood and rope to lumbering supertankers, leviathans of metal and machine. Millions of vessels and millions of seafarers are currently afloat in the ocean. And the two images that I have up are, one is a kind of rendition of some of the major shipping lanes and traffic, and another is the sort of distribution, one of these open source sites where you can see the number of ships that are at sea. And what makes this map in some ways even more troubling today is because of the pandemic and various kinds of quarantine lockdowns. There have been numerous cases of seafarers who have been stuck at sea for almost over a year now, unable to disembark from ships. So there's just the sheer volume of people and vessels that are at sea is in some ways astounding. And almost everything we eat, wear, or otherwise consume on a daily basis has some connection to these vessels and global shipping. Some 90% of global trade, approximately 6 billion tons of cargo, travels in over 100,000 cargo ships operated by over 1 million seafarers. The Western Indian Ocean is a central hub in this global shipping economy. Between 22,000 and 25,000 vessels transit through the Suez Canal. And this is a picture from the last time when I was doing field research prior to the pandemic in 2019, transiting through the newly expanded Suez Canal. And then we went into the Red Sea all the way to Dubai. So, from 2005 to 2012, a dramatic upsurge in maritime piracy transformed the sea space. During this time period, over 1,000 ships were attacked. Of these, 218 resulted in successful hijackings, with abduction of at least 4,000 crew members of 125 nationalities, and a payment of over 400 million in ransoms. In contrast to maritime piracy in other parts of the world, piracy in the Western Indian Ocean operates almost exclusively on a hijack and ransom basis, with crew, cargo, and ship held hostage until negotiators secure a ransom, a process that could take as little as a few weeks to as long as 3 years. A ransom requires willing parties and a structure of exchange. At an empirical level, piracy would not exist without some kind of tacit agreement between the various actors involved in this world and the infrastructures of communication and mobility that make negotiations and ransom payments possible. Rather than a form of mere lawlessness or crime, piracy, as the book and this talk argues, is an entree into the global economy and a space of profit and possibility. The talk and the book project from which this talk emerges elaborates this world of profit and possibility, a world of protection, as I argue, that emerges in the aftermath of a hijacking. The maritime world as a journey beyond the threshold of land is one premised on the commingling of risk and opportunity. Navigating it requires an expansion of domestic space or other modes of domesticating strangers. To leave behind the solidity of terra firma and traverse liquid paths is to embrace a universe of peril and possibility. From insurance contracts to charms and spells, from fortified armadas to the presence of naval destroyers, central to making things move within long-distance trade practices, especially at sea, are technologies and modes of protection. Beyond the Indian littoral, protection offers a unique vantage point from which to reflect on the seemingly intractable questions of safety in a seemingly insecure world. What does it mean to be safe? Who gets to be safe? The giving, receiving, and contestation of what I term protection here is central to understanding encounters that constitute our world. As an infrastructure of sociality, a simultaneous presence in relationships of kinship, in claims between citizens and states, between guests and hosts, and even between pirates and hostages, protection evokes a feeling of comfort and safety. It is the relationship between parent and child, a form of care that enmeshes humans and non-humans alike. But protection also has an ominous quality about it. Think here of the protection racket, the mobster who offers protection from his own wrath. And this is a gendered world, as I highlight in the book. Think also of the violence enacted in order to protect. To protect is sometimes to kill. So these dualities, both the end as well as the endurance and ephemerality of safety and violation, are inherent to the world of protection that this talk sketches. It is simultaneously a juridical engagement, an offer of refuge and sanctuary, and a form of labor and intimacy. Protection helps explain the rise and fall and potential renewal of maritime piracy in the Western Indian Ocean, and processes of mooring and moving in a world that constantly blurs between hospitality and hostility, capture and freedom, land and sea. Ships, those living microcultural, micropolitical systems, as Paul Gilroy has noted, are the perfect vantage point from where to narrate this concept of protection. In what follows, I tell the story at sea through two vessels. I begin by first re-narrating the rise of piracy off the coast of Somalia. What we do is different. In Asia, they make whole ships disappear. In Africa, he meant West Africa, they steal fuel. We just catch fish. I was sitting with Ali on a beach on the Gulf of Aden in Isle in northern Somalia. As the sky and sea shimmered in the afternoon sun, Ali pointed to the ships out in distance, and you can see them in the sort of hazy distance, an oil tanker, I guess, yeah, it was an oil tanker that had been captured that was just held hostage. Pointing to various ships, he said, "That one is from Korea, this one is from Greece." As he pointed towards the sea, he told me tales of various ships that had been captured and were anchored just offshore. On a map, the distance between Garowe, the capital of Puntland, and Isle doesn't seem insurmountable. Google Maps had claimed that this mere 200 kilometers would be traveled in about 2 hours. But traveling after the rainy season, however, meant these 12 grueling hours, that this trip turned into 12 grueling hours, including a flat tire and a minor rock slide. The first thing one sees when one gets to Isle is the old Dervish fort of Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, whose forces fought the 19th century British expansion into Somaliland. Past the fort, the Indian Ocean comes into view, choppy surf breaking along a long, uninterrupted coastline and howling wind greeted me as I made my way to the beach. Ali had been waiting for me at the beach, and we walked to a rooftop for afternoon tea. He launched at that point into what turned out to be a fairly emblematic story about his transition from fisherman to pirate. I was born 3 houses away when we met on the beach. This is my home, this is my ocean. I grew up catching lobster, tuna, and snapper. One night, a trawler cut our nets when we were fishing not far from the coast. A few of us decided enough was enough, and we boarded the boat. We made the captain pay $1,000 as a tax to fish in our waters. We went back to the village and told everyone about it, he said. Soon, others started getting on fiber boats and chasing trawlers to get money from them. This is how we became pirates. After a while, we started going after bigger boats. I used to capture small fish, he said. Now I capture a different kind of fish, a bigger fish. This moment of transforming ships into fish simultaneously minimizes the violence of piracy, but also brings in longer histories of making claims over objects at sea and indeed on land, as well as the ways that ecology, geopolitics all came together in some ways to create the conditions that transformed fishermen into pirates, right? So here we have a map of the Indian Ocean with all the various currents, and these come into play in some ways creating the kinds of infrastructures that made piracy possible. And in my book, one of my main interventions is to bring into view an idea of what I call the pastoral commons, where pastoral notions of capture and redistribution get mapped onto the ocean, thus moving beyond a kind of firm distinction between land and sea, right? But rather what we have is a constant moving back and forth between these two currents. Here, I want to focus on one particular moment, namely the rise of an economy of protection built around fish licenses from the 1970s onwards, in order to trace the jurisdiction of protection and emphasize a history of piracy that is not one simply of state failure or criminality. Right? The way in which we often understand why piracy happened is told through the idea of the failed state, the fact that there was no state and no centralized government in Somalia, and therefore piracy as some kind of natural result of that. And my work is in some ways pushing back at it and asking to what extent, what were the kind of contingencies, the historical moments, geographies that led to this emergence of piracy. And one of them has to do with a particular sort of conundrum that we have of a coastline that is sort of rich in marine resources like fish, lobster, other seafood, and simultaneously, at least in the 1970s, 80s, an absence of an infrastructure on land that allowed for that to be harvested, and a kind of cultural preference for not eating seafood, right? So as long as the 14th century, you have these, in historical narratives, references to just the abundant fecundity of Somali waters. So in his travel memoirs, Ibn Battuta recounted tales of the Somali coast as the abode of jinns, where fish and the bounty of sea is so plentiful, it casts itself onto the shore. Yet, in spite of this bounty of the sea, fish and fishing have been marginal to ideas of pastoralism that shaped the Somali peninsula. This began to change in 1969, when the military regime of Siad Barre came into power in a coup d'etat following the assassination of the first Somali president, Ali Sharmaki. Siad Barre's regime launched a project of scientific socialism to modernize the Somali economy. The development of fisheries and the exploitation of marine resources was a key component of this broader move towards economic self-sufficiency. And the Bari regime, initially with Soviet and later Italian support, sought to develop this coastal economy. It was in this context that many, like Ali's family, who we met earlier, were resettled onto the coast. As Ali explained, he used to listen to Radio Mogadishu back in the 1970s. One afternoon, the presenter started talking about fish and selling fish and eating fish as important to this project of self-sufficiency. This was surprising to me because most Somalis don't like to eat fish, he said. The Ogaden, my mother's family, have a saying, don't trust a man whose mouth smells of fish. Siad Barre tried to change all that. When he was president, we used to hear radio's jingles that said, let us fish and make profits. The government first sent to Las Coray, where we worked in a tuna factory. Afterwards, we came to Isle, and my brothers got a fiber boat and fishing nets. And we went to sea to become guards for the Italian trawlers and sell fish to the Italians. So in many ways, scientific socialism is seen as a kind of precursor to the dissolution of the Somali state. And part of what I try to argue in the book is to look at some of these afterlives of seemingly failed projects nonetheless, and see how they transformed ideas about property on land and sea. And in particular, on the Somali coast, there was an attempted transformation of a trans-regional, pre-colonial and colonial economy that was built around coastal maritime trade into a resource-intensive fishing economy, so transforming the sea into a national resource as opposed to simply a place for movement and trade and exchange, right? So, but this was not simply a kind of story of privatization. As anthropologists working on property relations in other places, including in socialist and post-socialist Europe, such as Catherine Verdery and others, have reminded us, these processes of nationalization are never straightforward transformations of private property into public property, but processes of making and unmaking certain kinds of relationships in often contingent and open-ended ways. Similarly, in Somalia, scientific socialism's remodeling of property relations defy these teleologies of public to private, private to public, clan to development, from long-distance trade to resource extraction. So in fact, around these fish licenses, a whole system of interaction was created where foreign vessels would purchase access to Somali coastal waters in exchange for a fee. And often Somali fishermen would work alongside these foreign fleets in order to protect trawlers and police this de facto enclosure. The village of Banderbela was one of the first sites to develop this system, and a former government official explained how this licensing system worked. When some fish wanted to fish near our village, he said, they agreed to pay us a monthly fee so that we stayed out of the way. They also hired a number of men from here to give protection to trawlers and make sure no other vessels came into the area. Most of the time, we were just keeping the area free from fishermen from Bosaso or other places on the coast. Villagers recalled that the trawlers began to arrive from other countries in the 1980s. While most of these vessels stayed away from the coast or were chased away by local protection groups, many interviewees pointed to Norwegian trawlers attempting to make similar protection deals with local communities. A number of these trawlers had obtained licenses from the regime in Mogadishu and hired groups such as local protection groups in Banderbela to keep other fishing boats out of water. So essentially, what was happening in the 1980s in Somalia is there was a greater demand for global seafood in general, things like the appearance of sushi in North America, in malls and other places, the kind of moving from very specialized diets to something that was mass produced, and regulations in the North Atlantic and the North Sea after there had been a series of fish stock collapses there. There was a move towards the Somali coast as one of the most productive fishery ecosystems. And so in that sense, so much of the story that was unfolding off the coast of Somalia was a result of regulatory shifts that were happening elsewhere that predated the collapse of the state. So that's one of the main arguments in the book, is to say that the system that was in place, this kind of protection system, which in many ways has reemerged in the last few years, and I'll talk briefly about that in the end of the talk, is one that had a relationship to the state, but also to these larger systems of governance and regulations. And what happened on the coast was that as equipment broke down and production in fish factories dwindled, with the increase in foreign trawlers coming in and an inability to compete with them, this dwindling created a system where where licenses rather than fish became targets of capture. At the local level, this form of licensing was mirrored in the interactions between newly resettled pastoralists and fishing communities that had traditionally inhabited the coast. A large number of pastoralists resisted the transformation into fishermen and instead loaned out fishing equipment and boats to coastal fishing communities. So this system both worked within and transformed pre-existing pastoral property relations. This is not to suggest that this was a harmonious system or one geared towards sustainability or benefit for Somali fishermen. Violent confrontations were in many ways the norm. In addition, foreign trawlers, in particular those using bottom trawling techniques, greatly harmed local fishing grounds and impacted artisanal fishing communities. So following the collapse of the Somali state, there was a rise of a number of local Coast Guard systems. And the system of protection and licensing that existed was rescaled when semi-autonomous regions such as Puntland turned to private security companies to extract rents from the sea. And in doing so, they eventually transitioned from licensing to piracy. This was a key moment in the shift from catching fish to capturing ships. Private Coast Guard initiatives of the newly emergent Puntland regime transformed this maritime world of licensing and rent-seeking, along with a host of technologies, including mobile phones, global remittance systems, and the proliferation of small arms and access to powerful outward motors. So official Coast Guards sort of fell out of favor, and when that happened, you had what they left behind was in essence an army of well-trained, unemployed men who took to the seas to extract revenues from fishing vessels, dhows, and cargo ships. This story of licensing, of protection as jurisdiction, locates piracy within histories and contestations over property, access, and wealth in this oceanic space. Focusing on historical and scalar transformations of property regimes not only provides an alternative understanding for the emergence of piracy in its current guise, but also the ways in which taking without giving, capture, entails forms of relationality crafted often through violence across scale and time. So one of the things that happened in the 1990s, early 2000s is piracy transformed from selling licenses to a system of hijack and ransom, bringing into the same view an alternative system of connectivity that brought, rescaled the geography of piracy. Instead of going out and hijacking trawlers, now people were going out and hijacking cargo ships, creating in some ways an economy that connected London to Somalia, that connected risk negotiators to translators in Somali. And this was a very productive and successful economy. And here you I have just in 2010, the number of vessels that were hijacked and the sort of ransoms that were released during the time that I was doing field research in Somalia. And this ransom economy was a spectacle in some ways, and similar to how one of the kind of ways that we understand piracy and elsewhere, there's, people bought pink limousines, there were tales of excess and grandeur. But one of the other things that the successful ransom economy did was created an international legal regime of counter-piracy, of UN-sanctioned naval vessels that were transiting through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, offering protection and patrolling the sea lanes of the Gulf of Aden, including Somali territorial waters. One of the consequences of this policing system at sea was that it pushed piracy farther out into the vast expanses of the Indian Ocean. As piracy became a floating diaspora scattered across the Western Indian Ocean, with attacks occurring as close to 40 miles off the coast of India, a new old vessel became central to piracy. And in the final section of this talk, I want to focus on this unwitting accomplice to pirates, the dhow. The embodiment of dense trade networks of the Indian Ocean and also an object of its regulation, the dhow by the 19th century was already a vestige of the past. As the historian Eric Gilbert has noted, the dhow trade was understood as part of a longer and colonial discourse of modernity and tradition, seen as a pre-modern traditional world of trading slaves and spices. The dhow was for the British, French, and Italian in the Western Indian Ocean an anachronism in an era of free trade and steamers. Scholars working on the Indian Ocean, particularly historians like Eric Gilbert, Jeremy Presshold, Johann Matthew, Fahad Bishara, and others, have noted the consequences of this discourse in transforming the dhow economy into an informal, illegal one in the late 19th century. With the advent of decolonization and a certain post-colonial lockdown in South Asia and East Africa, right, where we turn away from the sea, the dhow faded away into the register of the nostalgic and the artisanal. But there are plenty of dhows that are still at sea. The wooden boats that circulate in the Western Indian Ocean today, however, are nothing like their historical counterparts. And this is an image from a port in Mandvi in Gujarat in India, Western India, where the dhow trade is one of the hubs of the dhow trade, where there's been a massive increase in construction. And here is the Sharjah Creek. And in particular, Somalia was one of the main destinations you had, especially as piracy increased, larger ships started avoiding Red Sea ports, and the dhow trade became then a vessel of choice for traders who were moving goods back and forth into Somalia. And so here you have the port of Bosaso, where cement is being unloaded. But one of the things that happened in 2010 at the peak of piracy was an increase in hijackings of Indian dhows. However, these dhows were hijacked not as ends in themselves. Like, they were not hijacked for ransoms, but rather transformed into the contemporary version of 19th century motherships. During the height of the whaling boom in the 19th century, motherships were central in expanding the reach of the whaling trade by functioning as a base from which smaller, faster cutters could be launched to chase and kill whales. For whalers, motherships were both floating factories, but also ways of domesticating the sea, of extending intersubjective space-time in these watery domains. Instead of a vessel that allowed whalers to travel far and wide in search of lumbering giants, the dhow as mothership enabled pirates to capture a different beast, the oil tanker that fuels contemporary globalization. Thou's promised a modicum of stability in the monsoonal open waters of the Indian Ocean, an ability to traverse long distances and extend the amount of time that one could spend at sea. The sea is not an empty space, from pieces of ambergris to schools of tuna, from small fishing boats to post-Panamax cargo ships. A variety of objects circulate, float, drown, and are washed ashore constantly. The Thou was yet another way to blend into this crowded world at sea. In addition, the Thou as mothership highlights another facet of the ship. In an inhospitable world, the mothership was a place of refuge and violation, of hospitality and hostility. So in response to the use of Thous as motherships, many governments, including India and Pakistan, attempted to regulate the circulation of these boats and banned them from sailing past the Gulf in 2010. But in spite of this ban, a steady stream of boats traveled from Gujarat to ports on the Arabian Peninsula and from there onwards to Somalia. For the Thou Captain Rahimullah, this decision was straightforward. This is our work, he said. It is always dangerous. There were many times when a big wave almost wiped us out. Anything can happen when you are at sea. So when the government restricted travel, we just had to keep going. Otherwise, someone else would make that journey. Rahimullah and I were chatting on the deck of his dhow as he awaited his cargo of livestock to go across the Gulf of Aden to Dubai. After a long description of the market for goats and the change in trade since the 1990s, our conversation faded into silence. As we sat on the deck, watching the longshoremen load hay, he told me that his boat had also been used as a mothership on at least 2 separate occasions. Recalling this moment of arrival, Rahimullah painted this vivid story of pirates arriving armed at sea. Were you scared? I asked. Of course, they had come aboard with guns, he said. But this was not an ordinary hijacking. They were lost and had run out of food and water. They stayed on our dhow for 3 days, and then near Socotra, an island near Yemen and Somalia, they got off and disappeared. So in my work, I focus on this ambivalence. Mothershipping highlights the larger ambivalence that I emphasize about protection. These moments of encounter between Thou crews and pirates are certainly fraught with danger and potential violence. Crews are threatened and mistreated, supplies are stolen, itineraries disrupted, and losses incurred. Yet, when these tales are narrated to either other seafarers or curious anthropologists, there's also stories and a prevalence of accommodation and recognition. Thinking through this minor literature of captivity narratives allows us to see these stories beyond mere ideology or a form of Stockholm syndrome, right? But also signals the temporary reversals that occur in moments of capture, perhaps more broadly. As Rahimullah's story signals, lost, hungry, thirsty for water or fuel, or just looking for a place of shelter and replenishment, the pirate arrives at the threshold. This is clearly a moment of violence. The pirate arrives armed and holds the crew hostage. Yet, in the hours, days, and sometimes months of capture, meals are shared, movies watched in the intimacy of the hold. As numerous crew members noted, after a few days, the pirates kept their guns away. This moment of disarmament does not structurally transform the relationship or create a form of equivalence between guests and hosts. Most crew members I talk to, almost all of them, would refer to them still as pirates. But something happens, I argue. Instead, the anxiety and potential violence of arrival is deferred through this acknowledgement of disarmament. So the Thou transforms temporarily into a space of protection in the moment after hijacking. the AK-47 that's put away in the corner, the meals that are shared, and the movies that are watched, often always Bollywood movies in recollections by both former pirates and seafarers, are the material objects that mediate this relationship of protection. Instead of a move from sympathy to disavowal, or even what Achille Mbembe has called the conviviality of the ruler and ruled, we have forms of acknowledgement, of temporary living together in the rocky hold of a ship. Many captains would say, "Hum sab gharib log hain," we are all poor, transforming the enemy of the all into a fellow traveler. These everyday encounters are moments when identities of hijacker and hostage, of pirate and merchant, are transformed, but not dissolved. Rahimullah always referred to his hijackers as Alibabas. Other crew members would seek to reason these acts in an Islamic moral universe of haram and halal, gaza, raiding, or theft. Within a framework of geopolitics and long histories, a world of drones and post-Panamax shipping is, as my book shows, a continuing presence of protection. Alongside contests over sovereignty and value, this world is constituted through a slippage between violence and safety. It is in these everyday forms of encounter, within the extraordinary encounter of the violence of hijackings and the navies that patrol the ocean, that we see the workings of this protection economy. As a unifying category, protection brings to the fore problems of moving across scale and temporality, and a theoretical understanding of encounters that exceed the binaries of colonizer and colonized, native and settler, through which the question of encounter has been theorized. Instead of a parochial geography, as Eng Seng Ho has argued for terrestrial geographies, the protection opens up an expansive frame, which brings into view imperial formations as supremely mobile politics, dependent not on stable populations, but on highly movable ones. And so one of the main arguments of the book is that the protection in many ways allows us to understand the form of politics and economy that happen when we imagine that people and objects are mobile as opposed to ones that are sort of stuck at sea. And so it's trying to understand the kind of conceptual vocabularies through which we can understand mobility. And I want to return just in a brief conclusion to these ambiguities of protection and their everyday form of recognition by bringing into view the final boat that at sea that has sort of in some ways started all these stories, but has remained in the background for now, the container ship. Usman and I never made it to Ras Assir by road, but on a container ship transiting through the Red Sea on its way to Dubai, I finally saw the blue waters of that cape. We'll be entering the Indian Ocean tomorrow. Nicholas, a Filipino seafarer, had mentioned to me the previous night. The next morning, Nicholas and I went for a walk on the deck, and I asked him if there were any shipboard rituals that marked this entry into the Indian Ocean. No, in a deadpan way, he said, we'll just keep our anti-piracy watch for a few days more. We were walking amidst containers. Don't go too close to them. For safety reasons, he warned, suggesting a walk instead to the bow of the ship. Too bad you're not going to Busan, to South Korea. We would initiate you into the cult of Neptune then, he smiled, explaining the line crossing ceremony for those who had never crossed the equator. Someone suggested dressing like a pirate when we entered the Indian Ocean, but we've all had our brush with piracy, so it's hard to make a joke about it. Handing me binoculars, he said, see if you can spot land. This is the closest you'll see Somalia. As I stood amidst the jumble of mooring lines and anchor of this 360-meter-long ship and stared out at the ocean, all I could see was a deep blue, interrupted by a few white caps indicating choppy seas or coral reefs. On my old ship, we were hijacked around this spot, Nicholas mentioned, as we both fell silent. Suddenly distracted, he snatched the binoculars that were dangling around my neck. Looking out towards the water, panic visible on his face. "What do you see?" I asked. He ignored me, agitatedly scanning the horizon. Suddenly, his face relaxed. "It's dolphins," he sighed. Handing me the binoculars again, he suggested I take a look as well. "It's just a school of dolphins. You can see them playing in the water." I thought for a minute. It was pirates. Thank you.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Dua. I want to give participants the opportunity to engage with you and ask questions. So please, does anybody have a question for Professor Dua? If not, I would love for you to talk. I see a lot of students here. Right. So I'd love for you to expand a bit for people who don't have a lot of familiarity with the kind of issues that you discussed, the issue of how that you are interweaving questions of power, violence, and sovereignty in the social text of piracy. I also loved the conceptual scaffolding of your discussion when you talked about the mobile anthropology. Mm-hmm. I think this is also one way to invite people like Faye Harrison for conversation. I think it's a way, a bona fide effort to decolonize anthropology, the way that you looked at these and interweave them into how these provide us with such a deep understanding that does not necessarily fall into the trap of the failed state that Somalia came to embody and signifying, you know, in the political vocabulary and in the imaginary of the West.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you for those. Yeah, so in terms of just the first question about, you know, the larger questions around politics, sovereignty, and yeah, you know, and I think I'll kind of try and answer both together, because in some ways the methodology, the kind of mobile anthropology that I'm arguing for is a way to sort of say, like, what happens, you know, what would trying to decolonize our concepts in some ways look like, right? What would thinking about a conceptual vocabulary that doesn't imagine the state as its final, the nation state, the territorial nation state as its final resting place, right? So much of the kind of political imaginary imagines that, right? That is the central thing that we are supposedly seeming to, that we are supposed to want, desire for ourselves, for our subjects. And, you know, and the anthropology of neoliberalism, for example, is all kind of premised on this notion that robust territorial states are the kind of utopia that we should be looking for. And part of my work is pushing back and saying, what happens if, instead of imagining this question of politics that is through sovereignty, which is about a unified system of political theory, what protection allows for a certain openness for overplace, right? It comes from practices of hospitality and hosting that are both temporary but always built in these longer histories. And finally, that it's about thinking of relationships in horizontal ways, right? So in that sense, even the post-colonial critique has still imagines power as always working vertically through the colonizer colonized, through, and those things are there, right? We cannot ignore the Navy ship that is at the, that's at the background of all of this, but even Navy vessels have to, in some ways, be part, like, work horizontally when they're in the Indian Ocean, however briefly. And that's what I've been very interested in, and I think it's great that you refer to the sort of anthropology of decolonization scholarship like Faye Harrison and others, because in part this comes from that desire to say the pirate is in some ways an over-theorized figure of the West. It has been the kind, both as a utopic figure, as someone that we imagine as, you know, participating in radical egalitarianism. And there's some wonderful work by scholars like Marcus Rediker and others who in the Atlantic have looked at the radical possibilities of piracy, or that it's a precursor to capitalism in some ways. And again, in the Atlantic. And part of this is to say, what happens if we just relocate the pirate and ask not for it to either tell us a tale of freedom from the Western conceptual categories of race, class, and gender, or simply kind of a mode of primitive accumulation, but very much as inhabiting these alternate systems that are never alternative in the sense that they are always also connected to other places, to Europe, to empire, but nonetheless they have structures that cannot be simply reduced to them. And I think that's one of the claims through protection, is to not say, to find a vocabulary that's completely different, but one that works adjacent to and at times overlaps with it.
Absolutely. And I think what you helped us understand and learn a lot was the topic that Abdi Samatar tried to take on as a piracy of the rich and the piracy of the poor. Mm-hmm. And when I was reading your book, I felt that Abdi Samatar will be a very happy camper.
Yeah, no, and his work has been
reading that book, as we all were. Okay, I have two questions. The first one from my friend and colleague, Professor Uday Chandra. Tell us a little about your fieldwork and how it was like to research piracy today.
Absolutely.
Another one, just in the interest of time, the other one is from Sudesh Bania. How will you think this condition will change in the future?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I'll start with Professor Chandra's question. Thank you for that. Yeah, so the research was, so initially, so I have a background in international law, and in some ways I was excited, ended up doing research on the Indian Ocean through work that I had been doing prior to graduate school in Eastern Congo, where all of a sudden I realized sort of the surprise of that there was Swahili spoken there. There were large networks of Gujarati merchants who were involved in gold mining and smuggling that was happening through there. And I realized that, my kind of the Human Rights Watch that I was working for was very interested in sanctioning, and my interest became much more into asking, how did they get here? What is the long history that connects Eastern Congo to the coast? And so I realized I was going to be an anthropologist, perhaps, and no longer a human rights activist and lawyer. But when I started doing this project, I did imagine that the courtroom would be the sort of central site through which I would explore the question of piracy, because in many ways it has been such a legal question. And when I was doing research in 2008-9, there were agreements made with courts in Kenya, Seychelles, and others about trying pirates who were captured at sea in these national jurisdictions. But when I got to Kenya and started doing research, the courts raised questions of jurisdiction, so trials were suspended. And then I found myself through happenstance, and this is one of those things about anthropology. It is because I was living near the old port of Mombasa, ended up talking to some of these dhow captains who were coming from Gujarat, from other places, who were painting a picture of the ocean as one that was about, you know, an increased profit because they were going to Somalia, business was booming. And so I got fascinated by how piracy was, at that point, I thought of it as like creating this parallel economy of the dhow trade. And so I ended up doing research in Sharjah and learning much more about just the structures of maritime trade. And one of the things that I found very interesting that connected the courtroom to the port, to these boats, was a constant reference to protection. And it wasn't simply, you know, just the kind of a coincidence, I realized. And in many ways, the, you know, naval officers would talk about protection, dhow captains would speak of protection, insurance companies would talk of this. So I realized that actually that was the project, was about following and trying to understand what these, were they all talking about the same thing? Was it a coincidence of language that led us to, you know, and so that became the kind of central crux of the fieldwork, and in some ways guided where I ended up being. So from ports in Sharjah in Western India to northern Somalia, because in some ways I had met these sea captains who had connections to traders in the region, and I was able to sort of be protected when I got to Somalia. So, and then finally I realized that, you know, the insurance companies were also part of this story of fieldwork. So that's, it really emerged through, where is this claim about protection being built? What are the institutional or social structures that are making it? And that kind of made the fieldwork, which I think is in some ways similar to some of the ways that Indian Ocean scholarship has done, but also tries to push a little, because there's been an emphasis on following, you know, people, following objects, and there's wonderful work on that, or even texts as they circulate at sea. And one of the things that I want to try and do or contribute to that is by thinking what happens when we follow a mobile concept, and in some ways build its geography through where this concept is being articulated. So it could be in the Indian Ocean, but it could also extend beyond it. So, and so thank you for that question. And then Sudesh Banya's question about things in the future. There is so the last time I was in Somalia was in the summer of 2019, and many were talking about a return to the sort of fishery licensing system that I had talked about in the book and in the talk of the 1980s, because you have had new actors. This time you have a number of these state governments have created fishery deals with Chinese fishing vessels. And so there were often conflicts between Chinese and Somali fishermen at sea, and sort of tales of boats being held hostage. And increasingly, again, a way of thinking about the oceanic space as a national resource through oil conflicts about offshore oil that are happening. So I think one of the things that will change in the future is that a continuation of these larger scale geopolitics and claim making over resources at sea, right? So in that sense, part of the reason why there isn't an increase in hijacking of cargo ships is most of them carry armed guards. So when I traveled in 2019 through the Suez, the minute we got to the Suez, almost every vessel had lit up a sign that said, you know, on the radar, said "Caution, armed guards on board," and so that I think is. But at some point, these guards will disappear, or shipping companies will decide that it's not worth it to hire guards, or to go as though with oil prices crashing, you know, they can, because one of the things they do is they go at a speed that makes it hard to to hijack ships, but often there was a sense among shipping companies and on ships that one day piracy will come back, because in some ways those structures continue, right? We have the Gulf of Aden is still a deeply important place for transit and mobility for ships, and a coastal region where you have competition and exploitation that happens. So thank you for those questions.
Well, with that, we want to thank you so much, Professor Dua, for this excellent, excellent talk. We can't wait to read the, to continue to read and appreciate and learn from your work. And not to mention to invite you here as soon as we are all vaccinated and COVID is behind us in some way, even if we imagine that it is behind us. So thank you so much. And please stay in touch and keep us abreast about your new fantastic, ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. And yes, I really hope that we're all can put, vaccinated and put COVID behind us in some ways.
Yeah.
Especially those of us who haven't seen families or friends in a long time, that we all get to be reunited with them. So.
Amen to that.
Yes.
Take good care.
Thank you, you too. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course, our pleasure. Take good care.